with the intent of transferring Hawaii to the United States. That was the plan. Now, in order to achieve that in so-called international law, is that they needed to be a government representing Hawaii as a sovereign state. And for them to declare themselves a provisional government, the U.S. ambassador immediately recognized them as the de facto government, the lawful government, meaning a successful revolution, and warned the Queen, you attack these individuals, you attack the United States because we're protecting them. And these individuals, over the protest of the Queen, traveled to Washington, D.C., and on February 14th, 1893, signed a treaty of cession, transferring all of Hawaii to the United States. But that treaty needed to be ratified by the U.S. Senate. Now, the Queen, in her protest, she did something very, very important. And a lot of people may not have understood the weight of what she did or how profound it was. She did not yield her authority to these criminals, because they're traitors, but she yielded her authority to the United States to initiate an investigation. In particular, she stated, I yield my authority to the United States to do the investigation of their diplomat and military. And after that investigation, you will restore the government back to what it was. The importance of that point was that the Queen gave the US president consent to enter Hawaiian territory. Otherwise, the president would be coming in on the heels of that illegality of January 16th. Now, President Harrison did not listen to that protest. That wasn't part of the plan. It wasn't until Grover Cleveland came into office on March 4th, the very next month, that was Inauguration Day, where the Queen commissioned Paul Newman, a former Attorney General of the Hawaiian Kingdom, to travel to Washington and hand-deliver that protest to the new president, Grover Cleveland. When Grover Cleveland received that message and knew that an international law was violated by U.S. troops with a friendly country, that is when he immediately went to the Senate, withdrew that treaty from further consideration, and appointed James Blunt to do an investigation. And James Blunt traveled to Hawaii, immediately ordered the troops back on the ships, lowered the American flag, rose the Hawaiian flag, and began the investigation. That investigation was concluded in October, namely October 18th, 1893. Secretary of State Walter Gresham apprised the president on that day the U.S. is in violation of international law and they must restore the government back to what it was. That was then orders were given to Albert Willis, the succeeding ambassador to Hawaii, to begin negotiation with the Queen for settlement. The president knew he had to restore the government. The problem is, if he restored the government, those individuals who committed treason, which included American citizens, would be indicted, convicted, and executed because they committed the crime of high treason. The punishment is death. So the president knew that he had to negotiate with the Queen and see if he could get the Queen to grant amnesty. And that happened on November 13th, 1893 at the U.S. Embassy in Honolulu. They met, and there's a record of that. And at first the Queen said, no, I would not grant amnesty. The law is the law. Well, 3 additional meetings were done, and finally on December 18th, 1893, the Queen agreed to grant amnesty, and she said, I must remove all anger and hatred, and I will do what is best for the country. But the granting of amnesty was conditioned after the restoration of the government was done by the U.S. president and the military. So what you have there is that declaration of the Queen was then forwarded to the United States State Department, and in international relations, we call that diplomacy and exchange of notes and negotiation, which creates a binding contract, a binding agreement. You might say an arbitration agreement, that the president now is bound to restore the government to what it was before the U.S. troops landed, and after restoration, the Queen will grant amnesty. Now, all you have today, from then, December 18th, 1893 to the present, is the non-compliance to that international agreement. And then you start to see the U.S. Congress preventing President Cleveland from restoring that government and finding another way to acquire Hawaii. And the president failed to restore the government. He was rendered a lame duck by the Congress. But the binding nature of that agreement is still standing. So what you start to see is the provisional government building strength. They hire mercenaries from San Francisco. They arrive in Hawaii. They're protecting the provisional government. They change their name to the Republic, and they wait for another president to come into office. March 4th, 1897, President William McKinley comes into office. They started again Hanaho. They signed another treaty of cession on June 16, 1897. Now, clearly you can see this is evidence of people following a certain process, whether Hawaii, the United States, or even the traitors, the criminals. Well, that treaty was getting ready to be submitted to the U.S. Senate in December, even over the Queen's protest when she was in Washington, D.C. She filed a diplomatic protest. And what's interesting is she also stated in that protest in 1897 that the matter was submitted, the issue of 1893 was submitted to the United States for arbitration. So you might say, let's look back at that agreement of restoration. That's like an arbitration award. That is how the Queen viewed it. And then the fulfillment of that agreement. Well, President McKinley, well, he did not want to hold himself back with taking Hawaii. So he needed to pursue that and get ready to submit it to the Senate. And that's what activated the signature petitions here in Hawaii, the Hui Aloha Aina and the Hui Kalai Aina. And the Hui Aloha Aina managed to submit 21,000 signatures to the U.S. Senate in December of 1897, thus killing the treaty. The treaty's dead. What you have there are two failed attempts to acquire Hawaii by cession. Two failed attempts. Then you have the Spanish-American War breaking out the very next month, which is April of 1898. America has to fight the Spanish in Guam and the Philippines, as well as Puerto Rico and Cuba. Admiral Dewey defeats the Spanish on May 1st in Manila Bay. They're occupied. They need reinforcement. That is when Francis Newlands from Nevada submits a resolution, and the U.S. Congress passes a law annexing Hawaii called a Joint Resolution of Annexation. A Joint Resolution of Annexation is not cession. A Joint Resolution of Annexation is an internal law of the United States limited to its territory. So if we bring back the idea of Hawaii's sovereignty, clearly the sovereignty was not affected, but its government was. No different than in Iraq, you can overthrow the government of a sovereign state without overthrowing its sovereignty and its country. Iraq still exists after 2003 when Saddam Hussein's government was annihilated. The same thing could be said with Japan, Germany, and all other sovereign states within the framework of international law. So what has happened since 1898 to the present is not annexation. Hawaii was not acquired by the United States. What you have is Hawaii was occupied as a result of the Spanish-American War, and it has been occupation ever since. Now, it has been disguised with a civilian form of government, the territorial government. It has been disguised with the idea that sovereignty was lost and we must regain it. It has been disguised basically through the loss of our memory. You might say we're recovering that memory, and that is what my dissertation was all about, was putting that together within the framework of international relations as it was understood at that particular time and how it continues to exist today. So when we do now get to occupation today, it's one thing to say Hawaii's occupied, but it's another thing to say, what is the law of occupation? Is there a rule of law regarding occupation? And there is. It's the Hague and Geneva Conventions. And I used to be an officer in the Army. We're actually trained in that. I had no clue that Hawaii was occupied, let alone that I knew Hawaii was still a sovereign state. Once you start to apply the rule of law or the law of occupation, then we get into Article 43 of the Hague Convention, where it states that the occupier is mandated to administer the laws of the occupied state, much in the same way as they did in Iraq. The military government administered Iraqi law, not American law, Iraqi law, or even Afghanistan. The United States military did not administer the laws of the occupied state because they had to hide the occupation. So instead, they began to impose American laws in here passed by Congress that gave the impression that Hawaii was a colony of the United States and treated as a colony. Definitely Hawaii was treated as a colony, but it was treated as a colony in order to conceal the occupation.